Please, please, tangerine, sugar, honey, sweet. Funny how it changes how you feel, how you see, for your freedom, caffeine, how you looking at me. I love it when the lights hit on just right. Tiny tangerines, painted in your eyes. Please, please, tangerine, come back to me. Tangerine, this for me. Please, please, tangerine, sweet, come back to me. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up for your right. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight. Preacher man, don't tell me heaven is under the earth. I know you don't know what life is really worth. It's not all that glitter is gold. Half the story had never been told. So now you see the light. Hey, stand up for your right. Come on, get up, stand up. Stand up for your right. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your right. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Most people think great God will come from the sky, take away everything and make everybody feel high. But if you know what life is worth, you would look for yours on earth. And now you see the light, you stand up for your rights. Yeah. Get up, stand up. Yeah, yeah. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Life is your right. Get up, stand up. We can't give up the fight. Stand up for your right. Lord, get up, stand up. Keep us traveling on. Don't give up the fight. Yeah. We're sick and tired of your ism, schism, game, dine and go to heaven in Jesus' name, Lord. We know and we understand Almighty God is a living man. You can fool some people sometimes, but you can't fool all the people all the time. So now we see the light. We gonna stand up for our rights. So you better get up, stand up in the morning. Give it up, stand up for your rights. Stand up right now. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Don't give it up, don't give it up. Get up, stand up. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your right. Get up, stand up. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up. Get up, stand up. Stand up for your right. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up.
Hello and good evening, everybody. It is currently, oh, thank you, Sion. It is currently about 6:10, so let's begin with the event. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Fast and Perspectives, a discussion on climate or environmental displacement panel with the Student Environmental Resource Center at UC Berkeley. My name is Gabrielle Mbayek. My gender pronouns are she and they, and I will be one of your moderators for this evening. Thank you again for all who are joining us. Before we get into anything, I first want to introduce Nasim, who is on our planning team for the beginning of our land acknowledgement.
Hi everyone, my name is Nasim. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Community Resilience Associate at Serc. And I would like to introduce Karina from Segurite Land Trust to speak about herself and provide a land acknowledgement for us. Thank you.
Karina. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karina Gould. Oh, I just lost my video. There we go. Just want to thank the committee for inviting me to do this land acknowledgement today. I'm coming from my traditional homeland, Huichin. It's one of the territories of the Confederated Villages of Lashawn. I am the tribal chairperson for the Confederated Villages of Lashawn. I'm also the co-director and co-founder of the Segurite Land Trust. The Segurite Land Trust is the first urban Indigenous women-led land trust in the country, trying to put Indigenous land back into Indigenous hands. And so today's topic, I wish I could stay for the entire thing, and I'm sorry I can't. But this traditional homeland of the Lashawn people actually encompasses 5 Bay Area counties. Our tribe is made up of the 5 different tribes that was brought into Mission San Jose as slaves. And we are, no matter where we are in the country, we are on stolen Indigenous land. And so on behalf of my ancestors, the ancestors that have been here since the beginning of time, my current relatives and those that are yet to come, we welcome you into this space and place. Remind people that no matter where you're at, that it is your responsibility to learn who the Indigenous people are from which you work or live or play at, to make relationships of reciprocity with those Indigenous people, to find out what their traditional names are and the traditional names of the places that you live, to find out what the languages are, and to really try to build in reciprocity with those First Nations people. My ancestors have been here since the beginning of time, and we survived 3 waves of genocide on our territories by the Spanish and then the Mexican government, and now we are occupied by the US government. We are on stolen, unceded territories and have survived these times and are still here amongst all of you. We work on protecting and preserving the sacred sites of our ancestors. And if you're a UC Berkeley student, some of our ancestral remains are in your lockers and underneath basements there, and we're trying to get them returned to us. Over 9,000 of our ancestral remains and funerary objects are at the Hearst Museum and within UC Berkeley systems. We're trying to preserve and protect the West Berkeley Shell Mound, one of our cemetery sites, our funerary places, our villages and landscapes. And we ask you, if you're living here and you're working here and going to school here, to support the Lashawn people in preserving and protecting our sacred site. We've been in this fight for 5 years to save 2.2 acres of land on 4th and University, right down the street from UC Berkeley. We're connected to UC Berkeley from a village site that lies underneath Faculty Glade and the Faculty Clubhouse, along Strawberry Creek, down to our West Berkeley Shell Mound. And we ask people to support and help us to preserve and protect that site. But tonight I want to offer not just an acknowledgement of where we're at, but I want us to bring in the ancestors from all 4 directions, where all of you come from, that we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. They brought us here at this time, we believe, so in order for us to make changes so that we can survive as a human race. We are protected by the prayers of ancestors that have laid them down in our territories for thousands of years. I believe that the Bay Area, what's now called the Bay Area, is created out of magic. These places where people come together with amazing ideas and movements grown out of this land. It's because of the prayers of my ancestors that this amazing stuff works. And so today I want us to open up our ears and our minds and our hearts to each other to listen to amazing ideas, things that will propel us into changing the world into a better place, a way for us to think about becoming human beings again. In the way that we're taught that we are all part of a circle of creation, that we were the last ones that were brought onto this earth as human beings, that everything was brought here before us. All of the plants, the waters, the mountains, everything, the airs, the fires, the land was all created here before we were. We are the last ones that were created, the little brothers and sisters, but we're still a part of the circle. Human beings have taken themselves away from that circle and have created a big mess. We know that everything that was created here, human beings need in order to survive on this earth. But nothing on this earth that was created before us needs human beings in order to be here. And so when we begin to think that way, we can put ourselves in this back into this circle and remember where our place is to live in reciprocity with every other creation on this earth. And I'm hoping that this conversation that you have today will begin to talk about how do we come back to humanity? How do we come back to this circle of creation? How do we find our right place and balance so that we can be here for the next 7 generations and beyond? So that our waters are clean and fresh, air is here, that the soil is here to plant, that we have food and abundance that was once here in the Bay Area. I believe that young minds at universities right now are looking for those hopeful gems that will help us through the next period of time. And I also want you to know, as young people that are working on these difficult things, that these tasks are not just for you to do. In times when I was growing up, our elders would say, we're sorry that we left this mess for you. But we as elders can no longer say that we're sorry and leave this mess for you. We must work in conjunction with the young people and young minds and all of that we have in order for all of us to survive the next 7 generations and beyond. I thank you for listening to me and giving me this time to welcome you to our traditional territory. I pray that your families are safe and healthy and are taking care of each other. And as we go into this winter time coming up, that we take this time to really connect to dreaming about what a new future can be. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karina, for the land acknowledgement and for giving us your time here today. With that, I would like to go on to the next slide to quickly introduce the planning team. So if they would all like to unmute and show their videos, that would be great. Just to begin with myself again, my name is Gabrielle. I'm the Environmental Justice Associate at the Student Environmental Resource Center. And now I will throw it over to Sarah. Sarah, where are you at?
Hi, as Gabby introduced, my name is Sarah Shu. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Community Engagement Associate at Serc.
I can go next. My name is Jed. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the community organizer at Serc. And I'll pass it over to Nasim.
My name is Nasim. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Community Resilience Associate at Serc. I'll pass it to Christine.
Hi everyone, I'm Christine. I use the She series, and I'm a member of the Environmental Justice Coalition. And
Yes.
I believe Tess and Jenny aren't here currently.
Yes, thank you so much, Christine. They'll be coming at a later time, so we're going to get right into the contextualization part of the event. So Jed and myself will be providing like just some background information if this is an entirely new topic for y'all before the Q&A. So I'm going to pass it over to Jed to begin.
Thanks, Gabby. Can you get the next slide, please? Cool. So we just wanted, like Gabby said, we wanted to present some contextualization to the topic before we get started with the panel. We want to recognize that environmental and climate displacement today is rooted in the historical colonization and stolen land of Indigenous peoples in America and worldwide. Since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, colonizers have been appropriating more and more land and emitting more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, contributing to anthropogenic climate change. Many might realize this change as rising temperatures or global warming, sea level rise, and the onset of more frequent and more severe storms and hurricanes. These climatic events have been impacting people all over the world, as well as more frequently in America, and have been giving rise to the terms climate migrant and climate refugee, referring to both voluntary and involuntary movement of people impacted by climate change. Based on climate change predictions, there will be up to 200 million climate migrants by 2050, with 143 million of them within the regions of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, representing the inequities of global climate change disproportionately impacting people of color. Many of these climate migrants, contrary to popular belief, are displaced internally within their own countries. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, there were about 25 million people displaced globally due to disaster in 2019, with the United States holding the number 5 spot with close to 1 million internal climate displacees. And I'll pass it over to Gabby with some more information.
Yeah, examples of environmental displacement are virtually everywhere in the present day, from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, enhancing discussions on environmental racism and the forcible movement of lifelong residents into temporary infrastructure, to the erosion of the ancestral lands of the Yupik people in Newtok, Alaska, to very recently the fires in Northern California, specifically looking at the blaze in Paradise, California. There's a lot to be said on this topic, and that's why we are duly so grateful to have 3 professionals here today who can shed some light on these issues and their intersections with various disciplines. So with that, I would like to introduce the panelists. So our first panelist is Kaylee Ober, who is the Senior Advocate and Program Manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International.
Yeah. One of our other panelists is Dr. Sarah Song, who's a professor at Berkeley Law School, but with research examining issues of citizenship, migration, democracy, and inequality.
And our final panelist is Amina Lee. Amina is a third-year PhD student in Earth System Science at Stanford University. Her research is primarily focused on understanding the risks and impacts of extreme weather events on human systems and institutions across the globe. Her work has intersected with heat waves, food supply chains, human health, and adaptive behavior. Most recently, her work has explored how behavioral changes due to COVID-19 have influenced heat wave mortality risks in the United States. Prior to joining Stanford, she graduated from Northeastern University with a degree in environmental science and worked in industry as a demand response energy analyst and as a catastrophe modeler. She grew up in North Carolina and enjoys staying active through outdoor sports, hiking, and adding to her ever-growing collection of houseplants. And yes, please welcome us in joining. Please join us in welcoming all 3 panelists.
We're so excited to have all of y'all here. As a note to our audience, we would like to say that this is going to be the preset questions for today's Q&A, but we will have a moderated Q&A towards the end of the event. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask our 3 panelists, please be sure to use the Q&A function at today's webinar. And if you have any questions underlying that, please be sure to send me a direct message via the Zoom chat function. All right, so let's get started. Our first question is towards Kaylee. So how has climate displacement, as well as community-based and legislative responses to it, changed over time in the United States specifically?
I think the discussion around climate displacement in the US is relatively new. And I think the way in which we conceptualize it here in the States is really about a managed retreat. So we've seen evidence of this, obviously in New Orleans, post-Hurricane Sandy in Long Island, and it's generally around risk mitigation and disaster risk management, mitigation and management. And it's often about kind of buying back land or houses from people who might be at greater risk to different sorts of climate-related hazards like sea level rise or hurricanes. And so the way we tend to look at it is about property value and financial and access to financial resources. There has been some movement in recent years, especially under the Obama administration, to acknowledge that there are certain communities there that are particularly at risk to climate-related hazards, especially sea level rise. And so there's been certain communities that have taken advantage of or applied for different sorts of planned relocation schemes within the US. For instance, in Louisiana, there's an indigenous community on the coast that actually has applied for and won housing and urban development funding from the Obama administration. And they're in the process, it's been many years now, of trying to plan a relocation away from the coast, even though it's their indigenous land, because they're at such risk of sea level rise and are already experiencing some of the effects. So I think you'd find that there's two camps. There's about kind of manage retreat and buying back land and property, and trying to create incentives for homeowners to buy into that scheme, which is very much based on financing and risk. And the other end of the extreme, which is there's communities who are vulnerable, who are not able to partake in those sorts of schemes, and so that need government intervention in different ways around planned relocation. And the Obama administration acknowledged that, and we're able to offer support to this one Louisiana community. Now, there are other communities who need that sort of support. So there are communities in Alaska, also indigenous, who are asking for that sort of support and then haven't received it. There are some in South Carolina, traditionally Black communities on the coast who have asked for that support and haven't received it. And obviously under this new change in administration, there's virtually no opportunity for that discussion probably to move forward into this near future, but perhaps with the change in administration, this will be a more concerted conversation that can be had within the United States.
Thank you so much. Our next question is for Professor Song. What does legislative protection look like in the near future for climate refugees? What does it what does the capacity maybe look like, and how does it vary?
First, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I'm here to learn as much as I am here to talk. And so I look forward to learning from the other panelists and from you all at the Student Environmental Resource Center, which I'm happy to learn about. So I think before I address these terrific questions, I just want to step back and talk about the term climate refugee. My area of research is international migration and citizenship law and US immigration policy, which is a very contentious issue now and has been for historically in the US. But just the term climate refugee, as many of you may know, especially Kaylee in the work that she does, but the term refugee has a legal meaning. I mean, we use it in everyday language to refer to people fleeing persecution and imminent harm and danger. But the legal meaning of the term refugee goes back to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. And the definition, as some of you may know, is someone owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. And that's been expanded to include gender, sexuality. So on all these grounds, is someone who's outside, who has left their country of origin or nationality and is unable or unwilling due to fear to return. And so built into the international legal definition of refugee is someone who has already crossed international borders. And I think what's powerful about the framing in this debate, and now in light of the climate fires in California, but also after Hurricane Katrina, talking about domestic refugees, right? And climate refugee, applying it to people who have not crossed international borders, but are fleeing, right, serious harm, and then which brings us to this question of, okay, what should government response look like? And as Kaylee already alluded to, the existing, I think, frameworks, both as a matter of government policy and by scholars, it's pretty new and kind of ad hoc, responding to particular disasters, particular crises. And there's been quite a bit of scholarship on post-Katrina efforts at recovery and reconstruction and resettling people and looking at patterns. And there are serious inequalities in who returns and who rebuilds lives in the places they were displaced from. But I think one place to look for legislative protection, I think government role is really important. And if we look to Katrina as what do we learn from Hurricane Katrina and government efforts after, I think an important point that scholars have developed is a more structural approach that focuses on vulnerability and that shows that the pre-disaster event political and economic conditions create unequal vulnerability to natural and anthropogenic hazards. And so I think Katrina really makes a strong case for a vulnerability approach to responses, or thinking about responses that basically says economic and political processes affect the distribution of resources among groups, that shapes how individuals affected by the disasters respond, but also how government responds. And so one lesson of Katrina is often that local government is an important actor in investing in recovery and return and resettlement and development, but external funding from the federal government is really critical. And there also has to be a recovery plan in place. And then there's this kind of role that private market actors, land developers, construction firms, and we can think in the wake of Paradise, right, too, that insurance companies, and often the groups that experience the greatest losses are the least well positioned to take advantage of emergent opportunities. And this is why government really has to step in to help those who are most vulnerable. For example, disasters tend to disproportionately damage rental and low-income housing, which tend to be rebuilt much more slowly, if at all, whereas owner-occupied housing is typically repaired and rebuilt quickly. And as you can already tell, I'm talking about responding to serious events and then thinking about how do we help the people who are displaced by them. But I think what Kaylee is suggesting is we also need to develop long-term frameworks so we don't wait until the levees break after a hurricane comes to New Orleans, or until the next set of fires happens, that there needs to be. And I think that these efforts are just really starting. So we don't have a lot of blueprints to look to. But I think that in the long term, when I think about refugee crises internationally, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they're in charge of really responding to and providing international protection to refugees. If you think about what tools they tend to use, there are three main, obviously in the immediate term, providing safety and shelter and food and other basic necessities. But there are three more longer term durable solutions that they tend to use. And maybe we could think about lessons from that. One is the possibility of return, so that there's return, and in the international context, they call it repatriation. But in a domestic context, we would just be saying returning to the homes that you, or wherever it is that you call home. And the question is, I think with rising sea levels or with areas that are really prone to fires, I think the question is return possible? Is return desirable? Another solution or tool that the UNHCR uses that we might look to is resettlement. If it's decided that return is impossible, and in a lot of protracted conflict situations, you have international refugees living in camps or in neighboring countries with liminal status. So if you think about Syrian refugees in Turkey, Syrian refugees in Jordan, or I mean, there are many examples that often the first place you can flee is a neighboring community, and then that the vast majority of refugees living in these camps or in societies in neighboring countries for over decades without an opportunity for permanent resettlement. And so then you need to think about where could communities be resettled. And there's no task force or government committee I know of who's even thinking about that. Like, if there are certain places that become uninhabitable, how do we, and who is responsible for thinking about that? And I have to say, as hard as it is to wrap our heads around domestic climate migration, I think that one difference compared to the situation of international refugees is that in some ways the responsibility is ours, or the responsibility is the US government's, if you're talking about communities and people who are here, who are inside. And so at least we don't, because there's this abdication of responsibility in the international context, like the US saying, especially under the Trump administration, historically radically reducing the number of refugees that we've taken in. I think something like 10,000 compared, whereas historically we've been 80,000, 100,000 a year. And even that is such a small number when you think about the tens of millions of international refugees that need permanent resettlement. So I have basically said there isn't a good answer to these questions, and it's not a dodge. It's that there's limited scholarship, and a lot of the scholarship that exists is looking at kind of post-disaster and government responses, and where the government fell short in responding to Katrina, what the government could do better. But there was serious federal money that came in to help the rebuilding effort. But again, it was stratified. And those who had home insurance, those who were well off, who were in better neighborhoods, they got to return and rebuild more quickly. And there is still very limited data to know how many people were permanently displaced out of New Orleans and never returned. And we have limited data on just even tracking, right? That and so there have been some efforts. There's a interesting paper that summarizes the efforts, if you're interested, a 2015 paper by Elizabeth Fussell. But I'm going to stop there because I want to hear from the next panelist. But that's my patchwork of answers to say that we need more research.
Thank you so much, Professor Song, for that very insightful answer. We're going to move on to the next question, which is for Amina. So thinking about the very obvious and visibilized displacement of natural disasters like the fires or the hurricanes and whatnot, we were wondering if you could speak on the other invisibilized effects of caused by climate change. So thinking about what else displaces people aside from these very news and headline-worthy disasters.
So I think in the context of maybe post-migration, post-large natural disasters, and this is a very big question, but in maybe this like specific context, maybe thinking down the line to identify what those invisible effects are post-event and post-movement. So if it isn't a managed retreat type of migration, we're talking about influxes of populations moving around. In a lot of cases, we don't really know as Professor Song just said, where everyone is going. And so there are cities and towns that are starting to kind of get a 1-2 punch, where they are dealing with their own extreme climate events. They're dealing with their own environmental stressors, and then also the stressors of additional populations moving in. So as we're entering this world of a less predictable climate that's already largely different from our historic baseline, the things, most of our human-made systems were built with these baselines and with these extremes being extremes. And they weren't really built to deal with extreme weather in the first place. So as any structure for, say, public health interventions, agriculture management, or even like transportation networks, they're all built on a foundation that could withstand like a limited amount of variation, but not so much what we're seeing these days. So at the same time, in addition to seeing those like stressors and eventually failures of systems, more and more people are relying on them. And yeah, so like as individuals are trying to escape some of the effects of climate change, they're essentially moving to a new place that has its own challenges as well. So say a city might see spikes in population due to some disaster nearby, or maybe even persistent issue where there's maybe fewer farming or farmers are starting to move into cities and that kind of nature. And then let's say a heat wave comes into that same city center. And the systems are not usually set up for dealing with maybe that many heat waves or heat waves of that intensity. So hospitals and first responders are already stressed out. And then you add a larger population on top of it, you might not have as much availability for public cooling centers to act as safe havens, things of that nature. I think there's been a little bit of research around cities like Atlanta post-Katrina and how they dealt with population influxes and how they themselves were starting to see a lot of the stress from that. So I think usually, and this is like my human systems background coming into this, but I tend to think about, well, as we see one change, how does this reverberate through the rest of our lives? And I think my migration and population change and movement is a really big one, and the climate's becoming a much larger driver of population movement. I hope that addresses kind of like what you were asking.
Thank you, Amina, for your answer. I would just like to take a moment here to kind of ask all three of the panelists. So we introduced y'all at the beginning of the event, but especially given like y'all's answers to the questions, I would like to ask if y'all wanted to introduce yourselves as well as provide a brief summary of y'all's work beyond what we have already said. We're going to negate structure a little bit. Typically, you would do this at the beginning of an event, but we would love to hear what y'all's lives look like in this work, as well as just individually get to know y'all a little bit. So if I can ask, we start with Kaylee, if that's okay.
Sure. And, you know, Professor Song, it's very clear to me that you are a lecturer, and that was done so well. And you reminded me that what I should have done at the very beginning was to thank Gabrielle and all these other organizers for putting this session together. And so apologies for the slight. It really is truly amazing. You were able to put such a nice group of speakers together and able to hold this. So thank you, Professor Song, for that. So as Gabrielle said earlier, my name is Kaylee Ober. I work for this NGO called Refugees International. We are a research and reporting organization that focuses on crises, usually protracted displacement crises around the world. Normally what we do in a non-COVID world is go to places to speak to displaced people and amplify their voices within you know, the halls of policy and try to advocate for policy change. And this is to say that we also are an organization that's not funded by any state governments or the UN, so we're able to be very unbiased and nonpartisan with our assessments and as critical as we need to be to do that. And I run our climate displacement program. This program has been around for more than a decade. And so we were one of the first civil society organizations in the world to acknowledge that climate change would be a factor when it comes to displacement. And so we have quite a storied history, and I just joined last October, so my 1-year mark was last week. You know, I very much appreciate being able to be part of that history. My background before that was working with multilateral development banks and think tanks. So prior to that, I was with the Asian Development Bank. And before that, I actually helped the World Bank write their report Groundswell, which you had that nice graphic from at the beginning. That's kind of my background. Just personally, why I'm interested in this topic is because obviously I come from a history of immigration, of a diaspora background. You know, my parents or my grandparents come from China, Japan, my great grandparents from Poland. That's why I had the last name Ober. But so it's a very personal experience for me, and something that I really very much am connected to. And so that's why I've dedicated my life to kind of studying this or researching this. And obviously climate change is a very important factor in our lives. And I think I came to age where we really were focused on climate change. And so that was a natural intersection of different issues to focus on. And so that's been kind of the focus of my career over the last decade.
Thank you. Would either Professor Song or Amina like to go next in this?
Sure, it's great. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm enjoying learning more about my fellow panelists. I have been teaching at Cal for 14 years. I love it out here. I am a migrant. I was born in South Korea and immigrated when I was 6 to Kansas City, Missouri. And grew up in the Midwest and then in New England before migrating to California. And my research and teaching, I primarily teach in an undergraduate major attached to the law school at Cal called Legal Studies, but all legal studies classes are open to students from other majors. And currently I'm teaching an undergrad class on migration and membership. And this panel is making me wish that I had included, we had included some readings on climate, the intersection of climate change and migration. But we're mostly focusing on US laws and how US laws regulate immigration historically and today, and the political and economic dynamics that play into immigration policy and immigration politics. I also teach in the law school. The main law course that I teach to JD students is First Amendment law, which is really interesting, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And it intersects with my general interest in immigration because a lot of important free speech cases were brought by immigrant dissidents. And who were trying to be, whose voices were trying to be quashed. And I think that's an interesting historical insight. And I recently published a book called Immigration and Democracy, where I try to lay out a moral framework for thinking about what we owe, how we can kind of balance the needs of migrants, including refugees. And I want to I argue for broadening the category of necessitous migrants to include people displaced by climate change. And that was one part of the book, trying to balance that against some of the genuine concerns of political communities that receive immigrants and how we might balance that. And after writing that book, I realized I'm more interested in exploring that intersection between climate change and migration. And so I'm starting a new project. And so this panel came at a great time as I'm starting to think about that. That's, I think that's enough about me for now. Thanks.
Yeah, so I am, like as Jed said, a third year PhD student at Stanford. in terms of my background, I'm actually a refugee myself. So I came to the United States with my family when I was much younger. And I have I come from a family of farmers in West Africa who they themselves have experienced the effects of climate change on their livelihoods. And I think that has informed a lot of how I see both my research and the world to some extent. So up until I started this program, I wore a lot of different hats, all trying, like I was just very concerned about the environment and was trying to do everything. Worked a little bit in energy because I was very interested in the energy transition. Spent some time doing climate modeling and like insurance risk understanding type of thing. But more recently, I've gone back a bit to return to, I guess, my roots in a way, my background, and focusing on agriculture in areas that are understudied, usually in developing nations, and kind of advocating for the value of studying these regions, despite the fact that there's like a limit to the amount of data, especially when doing ag research in my field. I think there tends to be a lot of pushback because, like, well, you don't have as much monitoring data, so how could you even possibly look at this type of thing? And at the same time, kind of advocating for more inclusive science, specifically when it comes to environmental science, because it's well known that climate change is going to be affecting developing nations much more than kind of what we call the Western world. And yet we haven't spent as much time learning about both what has been happening and what might happen in the future. So that was up until this year, 2020, kind of threw a lot of what I did to the wayside. So I've shifted temporarily to a little bit of like behavioral changes due to COVID and movement, and been focused a little bit more on the West Coast. And some of the things that have been happening here, wildfires, heat waves, all of that, and how our change and how we live this year is actually impacting how we interact with our environment. I think that's enough about myself. Yeah. And thank you again for inviting me. This is a very exciting panel to be a part of, and I feel like it's only been 20 minutes. I feel like I've learned so much already.
Well, thank you all again for taking time to introduce yourselves and allow for us as the audience to get to know more about y'all and the amazing work that y'all are doing. I also feel like it's been, about like 40 minutes since I've met all of you, and I feel as if I am going to be walking away with a greater breadth of knowledge on the topic. So with that, let's continue on with our Q&A. I will push it over to Naseem for the next question.
So this question, any of our panelists are welcome to answer. How is climate/environmental displacement linked to white supremacy and colonization?
You're probably going to have to specify which speaker you actually want to answer the questions. Otherwise, we're going to just be like on pause. I'm happy for any of you to answer if you'd like to.
I guess if all of y'all have an answer for it, Kaylee, would you like to start first?
We all have an answer, I'm sure, and a lot of opinions about this. No, it's a great question. I think, climate change and environmental displacement linked to white supremacy and colonization, where to start? I think, first of all, the very system with which we interact with the environment, leading to kind of its destruction, is capitalism. And, there's legacies of colonialization, or the links to colonialization and capitalism is quite strong still, even today. And so we can talk about something that's very obvious, which is the way in which we emit carbon and carbon emissions, and kind of the morality around that. Who has historically emitted more carbon, has been more responsible for kind of this change in climate, has historically been the minority world. So the US, Australia, European Union, Canada, Russia to a certain degree. And so, and those that are feeling most of the effects are not those who have been responsible for those emissions. So we can start from that point, which I think is very tangible in a climate change specific question. But in general, the ways in which, certain types of communities or households are rendered vulnerable is based on kind of the underpinnings of white supremacy and colonization, right? So, and this is a very long historical and systemic process of extraction of resources from certain communities, how we value different types of resources. And as Karina said at the beginning, the way in which we act with the environment, with the very specific view of extracting things from it rather than living in harmony with it. Understanding what's valuable as a livelihood. So, subsistence farming is not seen as valuable. And what you have to do is input more fertilizer, use more water, have more harvest, be more productive. Rather, it's about making money and making money for certain types of people or certain segments of the population, rather than for, everyone within the village, for instance. And I'm sure there's many other examples, and I'm sure Amina and Professor Song have a lot more to say on this, so I will bow out and give them the floor.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Amina, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think Kaylee touched on a lot of different elements. I think it's a very hard question to answer because it's very, very big. And I guess just to maybe reiterate the essentially very similar points is that colonization, white supremacy have always kind of operated in this idea that land is like a tool for accumulations of like wealth and power, that it's not really, it wasn't really meant to be something that we like lived in harmony with, that we actually utilize sustainably, and as a tool to uplift each other rather than something that we needed to conquer. And I think that just has reverberated through how we've like built up our entire system of capitalism, and it goes down to our from what we see happening in like small communities down to our entire globalized environment, where we'll go to other nations and extract from them as well, and then take everything that they need to support themselves, to move it to other countries, and then leave them essentially with barren land, so that they are no longer in a place where they can subsist and are kind of forced to move and migrate. Yeah, I don't want to like rehash everything that Kaylee mentioned. So hopefully that kind of just like adds a little bit to it.
I think those are great answers by Kaylee and Amita, and I don't have that much to add. I think that's Amina touched on the maybe colonial mindset of viewing land and resources in a very instrumental way. And if you go all the way back to like the classical liberal John Locke and his very important and influential justification of private property, and this idea that unused land, right, that human beings had a God-given duty to use the land and mix their labor with it, and that's how you come to possess it. And that kind of thinking was used, those ideas were used by European colonists around the world to justify taking land and claiming possession, taking land, stealing land from native peoples, and to justify ownership over it. And I think that these ideas about private property and profit motive are still really powerful, and they dominate our world. I also just think, and this is a banal point, but just I think whatever the climate-related catastrophe or disaster is, I think it just reinforces and magnifies existing racial and class disparities. And it just really highlights who's vulnerable. And we could think about COVID too. and exposing the inequalities in, right, the disparate impact on certain communities in terms of who has been hardest hit by COVID. And I think the same thing goes for, or you think about Katrina, the example that I spoke about earlier, and just who was living in the low-lying areas, who were the communities that were most devastated, and why were they living there and not in other areas, right? And so I think it's really important. I think all of the comments that the other panelists have made point to the need for a deeper structural analysis. And that's why this question's so great. White supremacy, colonial, post-colonial, all of those relations are part of that structural approach.
I don't want to get hung up in this question too long, but as you've been speaking, Professor Song, it really reminded me of, it's not just about what is underpinning kind of vulnerability to climate-related displacement. It's also the ability to address, either the hazards as they occur post-disaster, and essentially offering protection is also still very much linked to white supremacy and colonization. So, where do borders come from? Whose borders are we crossing, really? When the 1951 Refugee Convention was made, it was made post-World War II by Europeans for Europeans. And so that is the narrow view in which it has been made and interpreted ever since. It will not be changed anytime soon. I know Professor Song probably has great ideas to expand it or make it more all-encompassing for those who are actually vulnerable and need its protection. But in today's world, if we were to renegotiate at a refugee convention, I think it would go probably the other direction. And that's because white supremacy still rules our world. Which countries are deserving of getting, funding or protection? Even just the framing of, these are desperate countries, these are countries that have a certain amount of being able to deserve intervention, is based on white supremacy and ideas of colonization. And so we've got to keep that in mind as we step forward we look into the protection question, which is going to face many barriers that are related to these issues.
Thank you all for your answers on that. And I understand that we could probably speak on this question for hours and hours on end, but we would probably be here all night and maybe for the rest of time. So for time's sake for this Q&A, let's move on to the next question. Professor Song, you actually kind of hit it right on the ball talking about the pandemic, because the next question is, in what ways has COVID-19 affected the magnitude of this issue, maybe the general nature of it overall? And how has your work specifically pivoted in the face of this crisis? And if we could get 2 to 3 of y'all giving your perspective on this, that would be great. And if possible, could we start with Amina?
Yeah, sure. I feel like I've alluded to this a little bit in my earlier responses, but yeah, so this year has kind of created an incredibly unique environment that we haven't really seen in our lifetimes. And so I was talking earlier about kind of limitations to our systems and what are the kinds of events that kind of show, they're like stress tests essentially. COVID in itself caused a very quick and dramatic shift in the rules of what we could and couldn't do. And I think a lot of those were set up to combat COVID, which makes sense because it's an existential threat to a lot of people's livelihoods. But then I started thinking about kind of the interactions between that and our climate specifically. So I've been working a lot on heat risks and heat stress this summer, and how COVID has made it really difficult to mitigate heat stress. For example, no one's in the office in the middle of the day during the hottest part of the day. A lot of cooling centers are closed or operating at half capacity. Malls are closed, which even if you were just walking or you were outside, if you needed somewhere to escape the heat, traditionally you'd be able to just walk into a store, and that just wasn't available to a lot of people. And the Southwest and West specifically, there's been a lot of unprecedented heat waves. A lot of records were broken, as we hear almost every year at this point. And in places like California, a lot of people don't have air conditioning at home. So there's a lot of risks to heat stress kind of in this new environment that we forced ourselves in. And it's hard to know whether to maintain social distancing guidelines to control the pandemic or to open some of these public spaces. So the unhoused folks, people that are more at risk to heat stress, such as those that are older, lower income, people that don't have central air, aren't exposed to dangerous heat. And I think situations like this are only going to become more common. We kind of have to juggle multiple like extreme, unprecedented events. So I've been kind of using COVID as a way to frame how we think about co-occurring events and co-occurring kind of extreme weather. And yeah. As a way to think about vulnerability and like what are really the areas that need to be addressed the most, and who are the individuals whose health and livelihood really requires certain parts of our systems to be maintained, especially when it comes to heat stress. Like you really cannot keep cooling centers closed all summer for all the good that it might do to limit gatherings of 10 people at the same time, then relegating people and saying, no, you have to stay outside in 100-degree heat is almost inhumane. And I think in terms of like research in the long term, that means when working on extreme heat, extreme weather, we can't really silo any of these questions of any one particular event and expect the research to be representative of reality and to serve our entire communities. Just because it's not what's reflected in what's happening. Just as the years progress, it's no longer just one bad hurricane. It's like a hurricane and there's a flood and there's a tornado all happening. Or here it's like there's a heat wave and there's a wildfire and there's a pandemic. So how do we like find those gaps? And how do we make sure that when we're making or suggesting policy or suggesting solutions, I guess we're really considering the full context of the world that we are living in and all of the risks that could be associated with it.
I feel like Professor Song should go next because I keep going first.
Oh, go ahead, Kaylee.
Thank you, Professor Song. So COVID-19, I think, has affected, when I think about climate displacement issues specifically, it in a number of ways. One is we're now seeing a greater resurgence in kind of border closures, immobility, there's been a lot of interesting headway being made when it comes to kind of regional solutions related to climate-related disaster and displacement, and that's namely around freedom of movement protocols. So that's essentially taking regions that are economically and culturally similar, like, so for instance, ECOWAS in Eastern Africa is often, or Western Africa is often held up as an example of that. And just recently, the Intergovernmental Agency on Development, which is 8 different countries in the Horn of Africa, some Great Lakes countries, were negotiating a freedom of movement protocol. And then COVID-19 hit. And you see these exact countries that were negotiating that protocol now just closing borders essentially and limiting mobility. So I think the futures of climate-related mobility have shrank. The room for maneuver for policy around it has shrank. And that's one way COVID-19 has really affected this issue. In another way, as Professor Song alluded to, it's exacerbating existing inequalities. Those people who are already vulnerable or precariously on the edge, for instance. Just speaking to my work that I just recently wrote a report on India and Bangladesh, we saw that COVID-19 forced really intense lockdowns in cities, and migrant workers in the cities were essentially forced to move back home. When they moved back home, in some cases, especially in India, not more than a few weeks later, Cyclone Amphan hit. We know that Cyclone Amphan was as intense as it was because of climate-related factors. And those people wouldn't have been exposed to Cyclone Amphan if they weren't forced back home by COVID-19, essentially. And not only were they forced back home, but now they're looking at not being able to return to the cities to pursue economic opportunities there, which normally would provide an outlet for their families to receive remittances to build back after such a storm. And so you're seeing kind of these knock-on effects. And now we see also with Cyclone Amphan that scientists are predicting that it'll be 3 to 5 years before cropland that was affected by the storm will be usable again because it's been so highly salinized. So what you have now are people who have been forced back from the cities, will not be able to go back, cannot send remittances, and now can't even eke out a living on the land that is there because it has been so highly salinized by Cyclone Amphan. So I think, you know, COVID-19 really underscores kind of the precarity and the vulnerability of certain sectors of different populations that might be affected by climate-related disaster and resulting displacement.
My co-panelists have been so thorough. I have very little to add. I think I just want to reiterate Kaylee's point about how COVID has really restricted mobility across borders. What Trump has tried to achieve, COVID like did it for him, right? And even though he also enacted draconian measures, I think COVID has seriously aided him. I mean, I think it's fascinating that he's been mysteriously silent about the wall in the lead up to the election, but that's a digression. I think, and then just also reiterate this point about COVID exacerbating and laying bare existing inequalities, racial and class inequalities. I did want to say that one maybe small potential positive development is that at least in Canada, migrant workers who are essential workers, so agricultural workers picking apples, migrant workers in meatpacking industries, that there have been calls to offer a pathway to permanent settlement and citizenship for that community. And I think it's the kind of public health, and there are public opinion polls that similar have been run in the UK, saying that these workers are literally putting their lives at risk, partly out of, I mean, economic necessity, right? But that shouldn't they be rewarded with, and so something like that you wouldn't see in ordinary times. The other thing that I just want to emphasize is the role of science in our political debates about whether it's migration or climate change. And it's just really depressing to me how oppositional and ideological, right? Some people are to just understanding science. And I don't really know how we can get, but I think it's just so important. And but I think a lot of people have, even some Republicans, wearing masks. It just that they're these public health briefings. But I think the role of science, that just is so important. And I feel like COVID has made that really vivid. And some people have really gotten the message, and other people, like the current president, are completely resisting it still.
I just wanted to say thank you for all y'all's insights. I really, really appreciate everything y'all have had to say. And so for our last question, it's pretty multifaceted. So we'd love to hear from all three of you from this and kind of get your different takes. But we were kind of just wondering, like, firstly, why isn't the creation of climate refugees specifically presented as an urgent issue in mainstream media, as well as like how can communities who aren't as plugged into this issue kind of become more educated on the topic, or take more actionable steps to become more educated? I mean, kind of on a more hopeful note, like, what does community support look like in these times? If any of y'all would like to speak, go for it.
I'll just say really quickly on the media issue. I think the fires, Paradise and the fires this year, it's in the media, right? And some have argued for using the phrase climate fires to just foreground, like, it's not just accident, right? And this is happening again and again. And so I think it's something about the structure of the media, and I'm not a media analyst. You'd have to talk to someone in the School of Journalism, but I feel like the news just goes to the event. And when the event is over, then the news isn't interested in that, right? And I think something like climate change requires sustained attention. What are the short-term and long-term effects? And it's just, I feel like coverage of that that's just not what the news cycle is good at. So there's something structural about it, but I feel like it's especially now with the kind of repeated fires and the air quality, like everybody's affected living out here. And I think it's hard to ignore. But whether that changes the way the media covers it, I don't know. I leave it to my co-panelists to say more about that.
Yeah, I guess on the media question, I also don't want to make any assumptions. I don't have too much background in journalism. I kind of would echo the same sentiment where it seems like because there have been so many more disasters more recently, we do see it a bit more in the media. And I've noticed maybe a little bit more of a push to attribute more of these disasters to climate change, because that was definitely not happening a few years ago. And I think part of that might be coming from the scientific community. Part of it might just be coming from public awareness and the fact that more people are just accepting of the fact, especially now more than ever, more people are accepting of the fact that climate change is both real and happening now. And as they see it affect their own personal lives, I think we kind of end up seeing that reflected in the media to some extent. But I definitely would say everything is based around the big disasters, and climate change is kind of a persistent issue that's like always happening. And I guess it's very easy to not notice. I guess when you're inside the pot of boiling water, that you're sitting in it, and it isn't until I guess it gets stirred up a little bit that you notice what the issues are. And I guess that's what I've always attributed media coverage to. But again, I'm not a journalist, so I don't want to like speak for them and say that is why it's not covered as much.
I have a lot of opinions about media coverage on this issue. What's funny is if you're, this is a focus of your work, you tend to notice every single article that's written about it. So to me, it doesn't feel like it's not being covered at all, but I do think there are a lot of pitfalls in the coverage that is related to some of the points that Professor Song and Amina talked about. One of which is the ability for the media to frame complex issues in clickbait or soundbite ways. And so I think there's a hesitancy to engage on the issue of climate change and migration issues because they're two highly complex issues intersecting with one another. And it perhaps does not create just a compelling storyline without some sort of disruptive event like Amina or Professor Song mentioned. But often I see when it's covered, aside from the disaster angle, is about numbers. So whenever there's a report that's released projecting the number of people who will be displaced by climate change, that's when it'll be really picked up by the media, because what's sexier than some numbers? And what's better to project onto those numbers than prognostications about how many people will be moving from the global south to the global north, especially to the borders of the EU or the US. So that tends to be the type of coverage I see, and it's highly problematic. If you want to see a good reporter doing good work on this issue, I would look at ProPublica and New York Times' latest long-range coverage of it. They have the luxury of doing kind of long-range coverage because it's ProPublica. And so they're able to give this issue a little bit more justice, although they do kind of play the numbers game as well. If you want to see some bad reporting around the issue, look up any news outlet, The Guardian, Thomson Reuters, that covered the recent report, the Ecological Threat Register, that predicted 1.2 billion people will be displaced due to climate change using really shoddy methodology. And so whenever you see reports you always have to be cautious, and you always have to dig a little bit deeper about who's publishing it, why they're publishing it, how they came to be talking about these issues, and why they're talking about these issues. And so that's just my little piece on the media bit.
Thank you so much for all those answers. I guess just to add on to that, like, what does support kind of look like in not just like in communities for those who are displaced, but just like in general for this whole movement?
Well, one concrete thing is, depending on how the election turns out, we need to drastically increase the number of refugees, international refugees, that the US takes in. It's at a historically low level since the program started, and even 100,000 is still too low given the number of refugees seeking permanent resettlement. But I think we need better long-term planning. And I think we need like task forces of scientists and policymakers and government officials. Maybe Governor Newsom we need like a California task force that's forecasting and thinking about fires, right? Because I feel like it's all very episodic and ad hoc.
In terms of this particular question, I would like to point out, Mina or Kaylee, do you have anything else that you would like to add onto this particular question?
Sure. It's multifaceted and multi-pronged approach probably to how you support any sort of community. I think one is we have to enable communities who are affected by climate change to have the agency to make the choice about how they'd like to react to those hazards, right? So do you want to stay and pursue your traditional livelihoods? What does that look like? We must invest in climate change adaptation and resilience measures in that case, right? We have to ensure they're equitable and just, and even the amount that is given to these communities is just, because at the end of the day, there are moral implications as to who is responsible for carbon emissions and these kind of climate related disasters. And that's a perennial issue that's on discussion at the Conference of the Parties that negotiate these climate agreements at the global level. Unfortunately, there's not been a lot of movement around like responsibility and remuneration, but that is a necessary part of the conversation. I think we must also support legislation around facilitating and supporting freedom of movement or movement and mobility as much as possible. So any sort of labor rights or migrants' rights in support of that is essential. And it also means that we have to start exploring what it means for people that need to move and that have no opportunity to return, as Professor Song said earlier. So about durable solutions, is it planned relocation and resettlement? Professor Song mentioned that the US threshold for the amount of refugees that we let in right now is disastrously low. I would argue the same can be said for many other countries that actually should be sharing the burden and responsibility of refugee resettlement. And the number of refugees that are resettled is also astronomically low in comparison to the amount of people who are actually considered refugees or displaced in the world. So those are some inroads to start. And I think that one of the Q&A questions mentioned, what can we do to support communities? What can students do? I think what students are doing and what like youth-led movements are doing is very important, and that's being vocal and using kind of your impetus, the impetus now that you have in youth-led climate movements, for instance, to generate change and advocate for change. And so, that can be through kind of the youth-led movement, Sunrise Movement, et cetera. You can join that. You can amplify those voices and ensure that, politicians are held to account. So Joe Biden famously has one of the most progressive climate plans for any candidate ever up for our presidential office, and that's solely because of the Sunrise Movement. So you have power as young people in this country to advocate for change, and so you should take up that mantle. And research shows also that having difficult intergenerational conversations, in particular with your parents and grandparents about issues that are important to you, particularly climate change and refugee issues, will change their mind to some degree. A lot of them are persuadable as long as you have that conversation with them. So if you don't want to join the Sunrise Movement, you can start really basic and just have that conversation with parents or grandparents who might not know about the issue and who might be on the fence.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. As we approach the last 5 minutes, sorry, Gabby, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, I thought I saw Amina unmute, and I wanted to make sure that she got her perspective in.
Oh, yeah, of
before
course.
we asked her one question for like moderating Q&A.
Okay, sure. I'll be very quick. I just also wanted to kind of reiterate the small community. I guess there's a lot of opportunities because a lot of communities themselves already have organizations within themselves, justice centers that are focused on work that has to do with economic, social, racial justice. And we know that environmental justice intersects very strongly with a lot of these issues. And in some cases, it's just a matter of kind of pointing out that and how environmental justice and work around both migration and just environmental protections and is going to help further their causes. And I think that's just one of the opportunities that we have to enable communities to take the action that they need, that they themselves have identified as the most beneficial for them, but with that like climate context as well. Yeah, that's anyways. That's all.
Thank you to all of our panelists for answering that question. Now I'm going to transition it over to Nasim to ask one question. We have about 4 minutes left of the event. So we were just asked like an overview, but yeah, Nasim, take it away.
For sure. So 2 of our questions had already been answered through the prepared questions, so I'll move on to the other one. So one of our attendees asks, from an Indigenous perspective, we, the people of Kiribati, are connected to our land. Though our country is predicted to be one of the first nations to vanish, we do not want to leave or be a refugee, something we're not even qualified for under the 1951 Refugee Convention. They say we have 20 to 30 more years, but my father's village went under the ocean 10 years ago. We are scared. There's nothing without our islands. What can we do to stay in our country? So they also clarify that any form of answer would be helpful, but also thinking if there's any legislative answers and directing it to Professor Song. But the question is also open to our other panelists as well.
Well, that's such an important question. And there are some researchers I know who focus specifically on island nations and island communities. And one of the frameworks that has been developed is keeping the community together. If it comes to, if it becomes necessary for the community to leave, threatened with rising sea levels, and then the big question is where, right? And we live in a world of bounded states that restrict and exclude people. And so I think this would require international cooperation, which is lacking, right? And the will of states to do their part, especially considering, as Kaylee said, who's causally responsible, who contributes most to climate change. I think once you try to connect causal responsibility with moral responsibility to offer solutions and to assist those who are displaced, I think then the world becomes much more interconnected. But those arguments don't have political traction. But I think that that'll be really important. fostering, working toward international cooperation to really assist vulnerable communities that really should try to be kept together.
This is interesting, Mike. Thank you for this question. Kiribati is actually one of the island nations most talked about when we talk about climate change and displacement. And actually, perhaps one of the most innovative island nations. You know, your ex-president, Anote Tong, is famously the politician that said, we must have migration with dignity. So we push back on the label of climate refugee. We don't want to be a refugee. So what can we do now in the face of rising sea level? What we can do is train and upskill our native population to be able to partake in labor migration and have the skill set needed to, migrate traditionally to Australia or New Zealand. And those people come back regularly and they send money back home, and that will allow kind of their household and different villages to be able to adapt to a changing climate. I think a lot of that movement was based on the fact that we maybe had a little bit more time before Kiribati was underwater, and sea level rise is accelerating at a rapid clip. We know this. We actually also know, based on recent science, that we've been underestimating the amount of sea level rise we'll be having by mid-century. And so it is very worrying. So I think probably the first step is, yes, we need to understand that people will be moving. We can invest in capacity building and upskilling workers from Kiribati to be able to partake in labor migration if they would like to. But then we also have to discuss what kind of a planned relocation looks like without an island. And actually, interestingly enough, some geopolitical scholars think that islands might be able to negotiate with surrounding states or those interested, traditionally it would be kind of Australia or China, interested in kind of the limits of their borders as set out by, I forget what the lines, how far away from the island lines of the borders are, where you can use as kind of trade routes or mine for mineral deposits or something like that to negotiate kind of resettlement in different countries and say, look, you can have access to our waters if you do that. Now, this is like a very geopolitical take, a realist take, probably not something that the average Kiribati would like to, partake in, but these are some kind of different solutions we need to be thinking about when we think about something as impactful as sea level rise.
And with that, thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us. Thank you to all our audience members for joining us today. Please be sure to keep up with the Student Environmental Resource Center at the URL posted above. Additionally, we have an evaluation form going out. Please be sure to fill it out so that way we can understand on our end how to make these events better and more informative for the community, both in Berkeley and beyond. Thank you again so much. And if y'all are at home, please be sure to give a virtual round of applause for all three of our panelists for joining us today. And with that, thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Good job, Gabby. I think it's so interesting to be here watching people like the number count drop, because I'm just like, all right, good job, team. But people will still be watching. Sion, if you can stop the recording, that would be great.